I'd hired dozens of housekeepers before, but something about this man's quietness unsettled me, as if he already knew the house too well. I used to think silence was comforting, that it was better than the sound of pity, or the whispers people make when they think grief can't hear them. But silence has its own voice. It echoes in the corners, crawls under doors, and reminds you what's missing every time you try to forget. That's what my house had become. A monument to everything I'd lost. Too large for one person, too full of ghosts I refused to name. The day Daniel arrived, the sky was a dull gray, the kind that makes the world look washed out and distant. I remember because I'd been sitting by the parlor window, staring at the rain streaking down the glass, wondering if I should sell the place. Every room felt like a memory I didn't ask to keep. The laughter that used to fill the halls had died with my husband, and though 2 years had passed, the air still felt heavy with the scent of him. Tobacco, oak, and something faintly sweet. Some days I could almost convince myself he was still there, just in another room, working quietly behind closed doors. The agency had sent a new cleaner that morning. They'd called him a good man, dependable, which usually meant cheap and desperate. I didn't expect much. The others never stayed long. The mansion scared them, or perhaps I did. I wasn't cruel, just tired. Tired of pretending I didn't mind the pity in their eyes. Tired of hearing the same well-meaning sympathy wrapped in polite words. But when the doorbell rang that day, I felt something shift, a presence before a sound. The moment I opened the door, the man on the porch looked up, and I caught my breath before I could hide it. He wasn't what I expected. He looked older than most of the workers who came through here, maybe late 30s, early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they belonged to someone who'd spent his life fixing things that couldn't be saved. His clothes were plain, his shoes worn but clean. Yet there was something steady about him, something that didn't belong to someone used to taking orders. His eyes, dark, calm, unreadable, studied me for just a second too long, and then he lowered them respectfully. "Mrs. Alden?" he asked, his voice quiet but confident. "Daniel Hale, from Silvercrest Services. I was told you needed help keeping up with the house." I nodded, though my throat felt dry. "Yes. Come in." He stepped over the threshold like a man entering a church, careful, deliberate, almost reverent. I watched him glance up at the chandelier in the foyer, then across the staircase that curled towards the second floor. He didn't stare like someone seeing luxury for the first time. He looked like someone remembering it. Something about that unsettled me. "You've worked in old homes before?" I asked, forcing casual curiosity as I led him through the hall. He gave a faint smile. "A few," he said. "Places like this have their own kind of quiet. You learn to listen to it." The answer didn't make sense, and yet it did. His tone wasn't poetic. It was matter of fact, like a man talking about something he knew intimately. I said nothing more as I guided him towards the east wing, the only part of the house I still used regularly. The rest had become a museum of my marriage, locked rooms and untouched furniture, a mausoleum for the living. As we passed the grand staircase, Daniel slowed slightly, glancing toward the landing above. His expression changed, just for a second. A flicker of recognition, maybe even sorrow. Then it was gone, replaced by that calm, unreadable mask. I pretended not to notice. "This part gets dusty faster than the rest," I said. "The windows don't seal properly, and the rain carries through the cracks. I'll have the study unlocked if you need to clean there too." He nodded silently, running a hand along the banister as we passed. His fingertips lingered over the wood as if testing its age, tracing the same grooves my husband's hand once carved into the railing with his wedding ring. It made my chest tighten. I turned away before Daniel could see the way my expression faltered. He worked quietly that morning, never asking unnecessary questions, never intruding. Most cleaners moved with awkward haste, eager to finish, but Daniel's movements were unhurried, methodical, like he'd done this 1,000 times before, like he already knew which rooms creaked, which floors groaned under weight. He even seemed to know which keys fit which locks, as if instinct guided his hands where memory could not. I watched him from the parlor for a while, pretending to read while he dusted the shelves. The rhythm of his motion was oddly soothing, deliberate, patient, careful. And yet there was something in the way he moved that felt nostalgic, like watching a stranger retrace the steps of someone long gone. At one point he paused by the piano, untouched since my husband's death. A thin film of dust covered the keys. Daniel ran a cloth gently over them, but instead of continuing, he hesitated. Then, without realizing it, he pressed one key, a low, soft note that resonated through the empty room. I looked up sharply. His expression didn't change, but the sound lingered between us, familiar and haunting. My husband used to play that same note when tuning the piano, always the same key first. Always. "Sorry," Daniel said quickly, withdrawing his hand. "Old habit. My mother used to play." I nodded, though my stomach twisted with unease. "It's all right." He moved on, dusting the rest of the room, and I tried to focus on my book. But my eyes kept drifting back to him, to the way he moved through my home with quiet certainty, as if he was following invisible footsteps only he could see. Boris, afternoon. The rain had stopped. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, cutting the hallways into stripes of gold and shadow. Daniel asked if he could finish the upper floor before leaving. I agreed, mostly to see how he handled the rooms no one else dared to touch. He carried his cleaning bucket up the stairs, his boots making almost no sound against the old oak. I followed a few steps behind, though I told myself it was just to check on his progress. The upper hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with portraits, family faces staring from another century. He didn't look at them as he passed. Not one, until we reached the end. That's when he stopped. I almost ran into him. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the door at the end of the hall, my late husband's study. The door had been locked since his funeral. I'd never opened it again. It was his room, his smell, his world, and I had no right to disturb it now. But Daniel, he looked at it like a man standing in front of an old wound. "I didn't assign that room," I said sharply. "You don't need to go in there." He blinked, seeming to wake from whatever thought had pulled him under. "Of course," he said softly. "I was just remembering something." "Remembering what?" I asked, more defensive than curious. He hesitated. "Nothing important." He turned as if to leave, but then his hand brushed the doorknob, just lightly, the way you touch something sacred. His eyes softened. For a moment the light caught his face, and I saw something flicker there. Grief, maybe. Recognition. Love. "Nothing's changed," he whispered under his breath. My breath caught. "What did you just say?" He froze. For a long second, silence filled the hall again. That same heavy quiet the house had lived in for years. Then he straightened, his expression calm, composed, like nothing had happened. "I was just admiring the craftsmanship," he said. "Old wood like this is rare." But I'd heard him clearly. Those words weren't admiration. They were memory. Nothing's changed. How could he know that room at all? As he walked away, I stood rooted to the floor, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. My pulse thundered in my ears. The study door loomed before me, still closed, still locked. Yet for the first time in 2 years, I thought I heard something behind it. Not a sound, exactly, just a presence. And as Daniel's quiet steps disappeared down the hall, I realized my hands were shaking. Because the last person who'd said those words to me, in that very hallway, was my husband. His every move felt rehearsed, like a man reliving someone else's memories. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, before the sun, before the house remembered how to breathe. The mansion always sounded different at dawn. The walls creaked like bones stretching awake. The pipes whispered, faintly, and the wind slid through the gaps between the shutters like a secret trying to get in. I used to find comfort in that rhythm. It was predictable, familiar. But lately, that same quiet felt off, like something beneath the surface had shifted. I wrapped my robe tighter around me and padded barefoot toward the landing. Below, the faint sound of movement echoed through the halls. Slow, deliberate, almost tender. Daniel had arrived early. I hadn't given him a key, and yet, somehow, he was inside. My pulse quickened, though I couldn't explain why. He hadn't done anything wrong. Still, I found myself holding my breath as I leaned against the railing and looked down. There he was, moving through the foyer like he belonged there. He carried his cleaning supplies with a kind of precision that felt practiced. Not careful. Familiar. His steps fell exactly where my husband's used to when he came home late at night, avoiding the loose board near the door that creaked when stepped on. Daniel did the same without looking. He placed the bucket near the base of the stairs and took a slow look around the room. His gaze drifted upward, over the chandelier, the crown molding, the wallpaper with its faint pattern of ivy. But then his eyes settled on something specific, the grand mirror by the front door. For a moment, he just stared into it, his expression unreadable. And then quietly, he smiled. Not a polite smile, not one of acknowledgement. It was a soft, private kind of smile, like someone greeting an old friend. Something cold crept up my spine. I turned away before he could see me watching and made my way down the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. Daniel glanced up as I approached, his calm demeanor sliding back into place. "Good morning, Mrs. Alden," he said. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No," I replied, though it wasn't true. "You're here early." He shrugged slightly. "Old habits. I don't like to waste daylight." "Of course." I studied him closely as he spoke, the way he avoided looking at me for too long, the faint hesitation in his voice when I asked questions. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him, and yet every instinct in me screamed that something was off. I poured myself coffee and watched as he began dusting the frames along the hallway. One by one, he moved with quiet precision, his movements fluid and unhurried. But when he reached the large family portrait hanging above the staircase, he hesitated. It was a painting of my family from years ago, my parents, my younger sister Emily, and me. Emily's smile was wide, almost mischievous. Mine was tight and composed, as it always had been. Daniel's eyes lingered on the portrait far too long. His cloth hung frozen mid-air. For a moment, his entire expression softened. His shoulders dropped, his jaw relaxed. He looked at Emily's painted face with something that wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. "You've stopped cleaning," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. He blinked, startled. "Sorry, just admiring the art. The detail is remarkable." "It's old," I said flatly. "Painted by a friend of my mother's. The colors have faded over the years." He nodded but didn't look away immediately. Then, with a quiet breath, he resumed dusting, though I could see the faint tremor in his hand as he wiped the frame. Something about the moment stuck with me, an itch I couldn't ignore. That morning, I pretended to busy myself with correspondence, though my focus stayed on Daniel. Every small movement of his seemed deliberate. He moved through the house like a man walking through memory, pausing at the end of the corridor near the reading room, glancing briefly into the library before retreating. He avoided the upper floor completely, though I hadn't forbidden him from it. Once or twice, he glanced up the stairs, his expression darkening, then quickly returned to his work. "What's up there?" he asked at one point, almost casually. "Bedrooms," I said. "And the study." He nodded once, but didn't ask more. The way he said it, the subtle curiosity in his voice, didn't sound like someone wondering what was up there. It sounded like someone remembering what used to be. By noon, he'd finished the first floor. As he packed his things, I decided to test something. "You're thorough," I said, offering a faint smile. "You seem to know where everything is already." His eyes flickered toward mine. Brief, unreadable. "I've worked in places like this before." "Really? Where?" He hesitated, then smiled softly. "You wouldn't know it." "I might," I pressed gently. But he didn't answer. He simply lifted his bucket and turned away, his silence louder than any response could have been. That evening, the air grew colder, and the mansion's walls seemed to absorb the weight of the day. I poured myself a drink and sat by the fire, watching the flames curl and twist, the light reflecting off the framed photographs that lined the mantel. Most of them I hadn't touched in years. My husband's face smiled from one, my sister's from another, her eyes bright and full of mischief. Emily had always been the wild one, the dreamer, the one who laughed too loudly and loved too recklessly. She'd disappeared a decade ago, vanished without a trace. I told myself she'd run away, to Paris, maybe, or some forgotten coast. But deep down, I'd always feared something darker, something unsaid. And now, watching Daniel's careful, deliberate movements throughout the house, the way he avoided her name and lingered near her face, I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that somehow, impossibly, he knew more than he should. The next day confirmed it. He arrived again before sunrise. I heard the creak of the front door, the soft scrape of his boots on the marble. I didn't go downstairs right away. Instead, I stood at the top of the staircase, hidden behind the railing, and watched. He moved through the foyer again, this time slower, more thoughtful. When he reached the grand portrait of my family, he stopped once more. I saw him lift his hand, tracing the air in front of Emily's face as if following an invisible outline. His lips moved slightly, maybe a whisper, maybe a name. My chest tightened. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. Hale?" He startled, spinning toward me. "Mrs. Alden, I didn't hear you come down." "Clearly." I walked slowly toward him. "That painting seems to interest you a great deal." He shook his head quickly. "Just admiring the detail. I didn't mean—" But before he could finish, something caught my eye. His hands, they were trembling, not from nerves, from something deeper. I looked down at the photograph he was holding, one of the smaller frames he'd been dusting. It was a photo of Emily. She was sitting in the garden, sunlight in her hair, a half-finished painting beside her. Daniel's fingers brushed the edge of the frame, and his breath hitched almost imperceptibly. He tried to put it back, but his grip faltered. And that's when I saw it, the raw grief flickering behind his calm eyes. Not curiosity, not fear, recognition. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker, as if it were holding its breath. I wanted to ask him why his hands were shaking. I wanted to demand how he knew her name, her face, her story. But something in his expression stopped me. Something fragile, almost broken. So instead I stepped back, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you really, Daniel?" He didn't answer. He simply set the photograph down carefully, as though it were something sacred, and walked away without another word. And as I stood there, staring at the photo of my sister still trembling on the mantel, I realized that the man I'd hired to clean my house wasn't a stranger at all. He was someone who had already been here. Someone who looked at my sister's face as if he'd once loved her. "That was Emily, right?" he said casually, but no one alive should have known that name. It happened so simply, so quietly, that I almost missed it. One moment we were discussing dusting schedules, and the next, he'd spoken the one name I hadn't said aloud in years. "Emily," he said, as if tasting the word, his voice soft but certain. "That was Emily, right?" The sound of it made my blood run cold. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to the syllables hanging between us. Emily, my sister's name, the one I'd buried beneath silence and guilt, the one no one in this house dared to speak after she vanished. I must have looked startled because he gave me that same calm, polite smile he always wore, as if he hadn't just dragged a ghost into the room. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "The portrait. The young woman beside you. I just assumed." My pulse thudded in my ears. "You assumed her name?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "One of the maids mentioned it, I think. Said something about your sister, the artist. I must have picked it up from there. But I hadn't told the staff about Emily. None of them even knew she existed. The portrait had been hanging for years, just another forgotten relic on the wall. And the current housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, had been with me less than 6 months. She barely knew my husband's name, let alone my sister's. So how did Daniel know? I forced a smile, though my voice felt tight and unnatural. "Yes," I said slowly. "That was Emily, my sister." He nodded, still smiling, though his eyes darted briefly towards the window as if trying to escape the moment. "She looked like someone I used to know." The words lingered like smoke. I wanted to ask him who she reminded him of, where he had seen her face before. But something in his tone stopped me. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something heavier, deeper, a weight of knowing that made my stomach twist. Instead, I changed the subject. "Would you mind polishing the banister when you're done here? The wood collects dust quickly." "Of course," he said, his expression smoothing over, polite again. "I'll get to it right away." He turned away, his shoulders stiffening slightly, as though he could feel my eyes on him. I stood there a few seconds longer, then quietly walked toward the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured myself a cup of coffee, but my mind was far from caffeine. I couldn't stop hearing his voice. That was Emily, right? It was too casual, too easy, like someone remembering, not guessing. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. Daniel went about his work as if nothing had happened, but I could feel his presence everywhere. The faint echo of his footsteps in the hall, the sound of his toolbox closing softly, the whisper of his voice when he hummed under his breath. He was thorough, almost too thorough. I'd find rooms I hadn't mentioned suddenly spotless. The old library shelves, untouched for years, gleamed. The curtains in the west parlor had been rehung and pressed. He moved through my home like a man making amends for something he couldn't say aloud. And yet, every time I crossed paths with him, he'd meet my eyes with a calm that felt studied, rehearsed. Late in the afternoon, I went into the sitting room to sort through some old letters, or that was my excuse. Truthfully, I wanted to see what he'd do when he thought I wasn't watching. From my seat near the window, I could see his reflection faintly in the mirror across the hall. He was dusting the piano again, the same one he'd touched that first day. His hand hovered over the keys, tracing the edge of the wood as if memorizing it. Then he did something strange. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. And when he did, a faint smile ghosted across his lips. It was small, almost tender, like he was remembering a song. I watched, breath caught in my throat, as he pressed one single key, the same low note he'd played before. It echoed softly through the hall, deep and mournful. I stood up sharply, and he jerked his hand back as though burned. "I didn't mean," he began. "Do you play?" I asked quickly. He hesitated. "Not anymore." "Why not?" He looked at me for a long time before answering. "The music stopped sounding right." His words sent a chill through me. I didn't know why, but they did. It was the kind of phrase my sister would have said. Poetic, a little tragic, full of unspoken grief. Emily had always said things like that. I nodded slowly, pretending not to notice how my heart was pounding. "Well, I'd prefer if you didn't touch it again," I said softly. He inclined his head. "Of course, Mrs. Alden." That night I couldn't sleep. The storm outside had quieted, but the house still groaned and sighed with every gust of wind. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the entire day like a film loop I couldn't turn off. That was Emily, right? The way he said her name. The way his fingers trembled when he held her photo. The way he avoided the upstairs hallway. None of it made sense. So, sometime after midnight, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went downstairs to my late husband's study, the room I had promised myself I'd never enter again. The key still hung from the old hook behind the grandfather clock, and my hands shook as I reached for it. The door creaked open slowly, the air inside thick with dust and time. The faint scent of leather and pipe tobacco still clung to the walls. I turned on the lamp. Papers lay scattered across the desk, untouched since the funeral. I pulled out the bottom drawer and found the box of old letters my husband had kept. I wasn't looking for him this time. I was looking for her, and there she was. Emily. Her handwriting, her voice, her laughter folded into words that had yellowed with age. She'd written to him once, months before she vanished. I hadn't known. My hands trembled as I read the lines. You told me to let it go, but you don't understand. He's everything I'm not supposed to want, and I can't breathe without him. I know you think I'm foolish, but I need you to trust me. He's not like the others. There was no name, no clue, just that one line. He's not like the others. I folded the letter slowly, my heart hammering. Downstairs, the grandfather clock began to chime. Once, twice, then a third time. And then, faintly, I heard something else. A voice. It was coming from the kitchen, low, muffled, almost a whisper. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. I followed the sound, my bare feet silent on the carpeted steps. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Daniel's voice. He was on the phone. I stayed in the hallway just far enough to hear, but not be seen. No, she doesn't recognize me, he said quietly. Not yet. My blood ran cold. There was a pause, the faint rustle of static from the other end of the line. Then Daniel spoke again. Lower this time. I know what I'm doing. I just need more time. Another silence. Then, she keeps the photo in the same place. I saw it. Nothing's changed. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying not to make a sound. Nothing's changed. The same words he'd whispered outside my husband's study. The same words he shouldn't have known. He ended the call a moment later. I heard the faint clink of a mug, the shuffle of papers, then silence. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing, until I reached the stairs. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark by my window, staring down at the faint glow from the kitchen below, wondering who Daniel Hale really was, and how he could possibly know my sister's name. When dawn finally broke, I saw him step outside to take another call, and though I couldn't hear his words, I saw his lips move just enough to read them. She still doesn't remember. I thought I knew every inch of my home, until I caught him standing outside a locked door I hadn't opened in years. There are certain doors in every old house that should never be opened, not because of what's behind them, but because of what they hold. Time, memory, things that never stopped echoing after they ended. The attic door in my mansion was one of those. It had been locked since the night Emily disappeared. That morning started like any other. I was in the conservatory, pretending to read while watching the light creep across the marble floor. The house was quiet, except for the faint rhythm of Daniel's movements above. Measured footsteps, the drag of a mop, the clink of metal tools. I'd grown used to his presence, though I still didn't trust it. Every day I caught him doing something that felt too familiar, as if he were following a map I couldn't see. Still, I let him work. Curiosity can be a cruel thing. It feeds on what frightens you most. It was almost noon when I heard it, a sharp thud from upstairs, followed by silence. Then another, softer sound, like someone's hand brushing against wood. I set my book down and rose from the chair, heart quickening. The sound came again. Faint, rhythmic, deliberate. It was coming from the attic hallway. The attic. No one went there anymore. Not the staff, not me. The door was sealed, the key long hidden. I walked upstairs, my pulse steady but tight, the old steps creaking beneath my weight. The higher I climbed, the colder the air felt, as if the house itself wanted to warn me away. When I reached the landing, I saw him, Daniel, standing motionless before the attic door, his hand pressed lightly against the frame. His head was bowed, slightly, as though listening. His shoulders were still, his body frozen in an almost reverent posture. For a moment, I simply watched him. He looked like someone praying at an altar. "Daniel," I said finally, my voice sharp against the silence. He startled, spinning toward me so quickly that his bucket clattered to the floor. The sound echoed down the hall, breaking the stillness. "Mrs. Alden," he said, voice calm but tight. "I didn't mean to. What are you doing up here?" He looked at the door, then back at me. "I must have taken a wrong turn. These halls all look the same." I folded my arms. "That's the attic. There's no reason for you to be here." He nodded once, too quickly. "I understand." But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked back toward the door for just a fraction of a second, a small, involuntary motion that told me everything. "You weren't lost," I said quietly. "You were standing there." His jaw tightened. "I thought I heard something," he admitted finally. "A sound. Like humming." I frowned. "There's no one up there." "I know, it must have been the wind." He bent down to collect his tools, his hands shaking slightly. When he looked up again, his expression was careful, composed. "I didn't mean to intrude." I said nothing, only watched him retreat down the hall. But long after he disappeared from sight, I stayed there, staring at that door. The brass handle was tarnished with age, the paint peeling in tiny flakes. Dust clung to the corners of the frame. I hadn't looked at it closely in years, but now every detail felt alive, deliberate, as though someone had been touching it when I wasn't looking. And I remembered. That room had been Emily's. When we were younger, she'd claimed it as her studio. She'd spend hours up there, painting, sketching, humming softly to herself. Sometimes I'd bring her tea, and she'd barely look up, lost in her world of color and light. The night she disappeared, the attic door was left open, the air smelling faintly of oil paint and turpentine. The last thing I saw before it closed again was a half-finished canvas. A woman's face, turned away, as if hiding a secret. I'd locked the door the next morning and never gone back. Until now. As the day went on, I tried to push the moment aside. Daniel continued his work downstairs, quiet and efficient as ever. But every time he walked past, I saw something new in his expression. A tension just beneath the surface, a flicker of unease. That evening I found him polishing the silver in the dining room. The chandelier's light glinted off the metal, turning the room golden. He looked up when I entered, his posture straightening. "Everything all right?" I asked casually. "Of course," he said. "Why wouldn't it be?" I stepped closer, setting my glass of water down beside him. "You've been here a few weeks now, haven't you? Getting used to the house?" He smiled faintly. "I think I've learned its rhythm." That phrasing again, as if the house were something alive, something that spoke to him. I studied his face carefully. "And the attic? Did it speak to you too?" His hand froze mid-polish. The silver spoon in his hand caught the light and trembled just slightly. "I told you," he said softly. "I heard something. Probably nothing. And yet you looked like you were remembering something, not hearing it." He met my eyes then, his expression unreadable. "You have a good imagination, Mrs. Alden." I forced a smile. "So I've been told." When I turned to leave, I could feel his gaze follow me. Not predatory, not angry, but searching. Almost sorrowful. I went to bed early that night, though sleep refused to come. My mind replayed every detail. The way he'd stood by that door, the tremor in his voice when he mentioned the humming, the strange way he seemed to know this house like it was an old wound he'd once tended. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint noise from the hall, a soft scrape, like footsteps on old wood. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Silence. Then, another sound. Music. Faint, fragile, distant, but unmistakable. It drifted through the walls, barely audible, yet achingly familiar. a melody I hadn't heard in years. Emily's melody. I swung my legs off the bed and stood, the floor cold beneath my feet. My heart hammered as I crept toward the hall. The sound was coming from above, from the attic, the locked attic. I followed the sound up the stairs, every step heavier than the last. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Not just music, but humming. The same soft, lilting hum Emily used to make when she painted. The same rhythm that used to fill this house with warmth. I reached the landing, the air colder now, almost sharp. The door at the end of the hall loomed in shadow, and from behind it, the music grew louder. I pressed my ear against the wood. The melody faltered, then stopped. My breath caught. For a long moment the silence stretched, thick, suffocating. Then, just as I started to pull away, something tapped once, softly, on the other side of the door. I stumbled back, my pulse roaring in my ears. The music didn't start again, but I could still feel it, lingering in the air, woven into the walls, like a heartbeat that refused to die. That night, lying awake in the dark, I realized the truth I didn't want to face. Whatever was in that locked attic wasn't just memory. It was someone. And Daniel Hale knew exactly who. When his little girl arrived, the mansion finally felt alive, until she called me something no one had in years. The following morning began with something unusual. Laughter. Soft at first, like a sound the house didn't quite know how to carry anymore. I was sitting in the breakfast room, stirring my coffee out of habit rather than need, when it drifted through the hallways, the unmistakable sound of a child's giggle. It startled me. This house hadn't heard a child's laughter in more than a decade. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But then the kitchen door opened, and Daniel stepped inside, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. His eyes darted toward me, then to the small figure hiding behind his leg. "Mrs. Alden," he began carefully. "I hope you don't mind. My daughter Lily, her school called this morning. There was a power issue. They've sent the children home. I couldn't find anyone to watch her on such short notice, and I didn't want to miss the day's work." I blinked at him, surprised. "You brought her here?" He nodded, voice low. "She'll stay out of the way, I promise. She's quiet. I just didn't want to inconvenience you." Before I could respond, the little girl peeked out from behind him. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Her dark hair was tied in a loose ponytail, her eyes large and curious, the same kind of eyes that always seemed to be taking in more than they should. And when she smiled, it hit me. Not because it was sweet, but because it was familiar. Something deep inside me shifted. I didn't know why, but that smile struck like a memory I couldn't quite place. "Hello there," I said softly, my voice catching a little. "You must be Lily." She nodded eagerly. "Hi. Daddy said this house is really old. Is it haunted?" Daniel winced. "Lily." I couldn't help but laugh, the first genuine laugh in what felt like years. "Some days, it feels like it," I said. "Would you like some juice?" Her eyes lit up. "Yes, please." Daniel started to apologize again, but I raised a hand. "It's fine. She's no trouble." He hesitated, then gave a small nod of gratitude. For the next hour, Lily darted around the edges of my world like a spark of light in a long, dimmed room. She was curious about everything. The paintings, the staircases, the echo her shoes made on the marble floors. Every sound she made seemed to breathe something back into the house, something it had forgotten it could feel. At one point she wandered into the parlor, her small hands brushing along the piano keys. A single note sang out, that same low tone Daniel had played days before. It was off-key, dull with dust, but somehow in her tiny hands it didn't sound mournful. It sounded alive. I found myself smiling as I watched her. "Do you play?" I asked. She shook her head. "Mommy used to hum songs. Daddy says I sound like her when I sing." Daniel froze across the room, his polishing cloth slipping slightly in his grip. I caught the flicker of tension but said nothing. Lily, oblivious to the shift, spun around and began humming softly, the same simple melody her father had once hummed through the halls. The sound was achingly familiar, haunting, gentle, and heartbreakingly sweet. "Where did you learn that song?" I asked. She shrugged. "Daddy. But he said Mommy used to sing it too." I felt a chill run through me, though the room was warm. I looked at Daniel, but his gaze stayed firmly on the silver tray he was cleaning. His knuckles were white. "Your mother," I said carefully. "What was her name?" Lily smiled, proud to know the answer. "Emily." The words struck like a blade of ice. My cup slipped from my hand, hitting the saucer with a sharp clang that made both of them jump. Daniel's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Emily?" I repeated, barely breathing the word. Lily nodded brightly. "Uh-huh. Emily Hale." Daniel stepped forward quickly, his voice suddenly too calm. "Lily, why don't you go find your crayons in my bag, "But now," he said softly, but there was steel in his tone. She pouted, but obeyed, skipping off toward the corner. I stood frozen, my mind spinning. "Emily," I whispered again, as if saying it could change what I'd heard. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "It's just a name," he said quietly. "Coincidence? Nothing more. Don't lie to me." His eyes flicked up sharply. "I'm not—" "Yes, you are." My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. "You knew my sister's name before you ever saw her picture. You've been walking around this house like you've known it all your life. And now your daughter, calls her mother Emily?" He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, thick as smoke. Finally, he said, "I didn't mean for her to say that." The words hung heavy in the air. "She wasn't supposed to say that," he added, almost to himself. My breath caught. "What are you talking about?" He stepped back, his composure cracking for the first time since I'd met him. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" He didn't speak. His eyes darted toward Lily, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming again, drawing something on the back of a receipt. I looked at the paper. Just a child's sketch, messy and colorful. But when she turned it around to show me, I felt the ground shift beneath me. It was a picture of a woman and a man holding a child's hand. The woman had brown hair, tied loosely. The man wore blue. The little girl stood between them, smiling. Lily pointed proudly. "That's Mommy," she said, "and Daddy. And that's me." The woman in the picture, though crudely drawn, had the same eyes, the same smile, the same shape of face as my sister. I would have known it anywhere. I reached for the drawing, my fingers trembling. "She told you that was your mother?" Lily nodded. "Daddy says she went to heaven. But he said when I see Aunt Emily, I'll know her." Daniel's head snapped up. His expression was a mixture of fear and despair. "Lily," he said quickly, "why don't you go play in the kitchen? Mrs. Alden and I need to talk." She frowned. "Did I do something bad?" "No, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice cracking. "You did nothing wrong. Please, just for a minute." She hesitated, then nodded and ran off down the hall. Her laughter faded with her footsteps. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned to him slowly. "What did she mean by that, Daniel?" He rubbed his temples, his breath shaky. "It's complicated." "That's not an answer." He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time I saw something raw and broken in his eyes. "She wasn't supposed to call you that," he said again. "Not yet." My heart pounded. "Call me what?" "Aunt Emily." I froze. The words sank into me like a slow poison. "She's just a child," he said quickly. "She doesn't understand. She gets confused sometimes." "No," I whispered. "Children don't make up things they've never heard. They repeat what they're told." He didn't deny it. And that silence, that heavy, trembling silence, was worse than any confession he could have given me. I backed away, my eyes burning. "You knew her. You knew my sister. You've been here before." He didn't move. "I don't know how," I said, my voice breaking, "but you're lying to me." Lily's laughter echoed faintly from the next room. a haunting sound that seemed to belong to another time entirely. I wanted to run, to lock myself in my room, to never see either of them again. But I couldn't move. I could only stand there, staring at the man who had brought ghosts back into my house, and the little girl who had given them names. Daniel's face went pale, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wasn't supposed to say that," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Not until you remembered who she was." I stared at the painting, my sister's face smiling down at me, and realized Lily's eyes were the same. That night, sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Lily's bright, innocent gaze and the soft curve of her smile. I had seen that expression before. I'd seen it on my sister. By morning, the mansion felt different, quieter somehow, as though it was waiting for me to admit what I already feared. I wandered through the halls, tracing the faded edges of portraits that lined the walls. Most of them I had long stopped seeing, but one now pulled me like gravity. Emily's. The portrait hung in the west corridor, where the sunlight reached only in the late afternoon. It had been painted the year before she vanished, her hair loose around her shoulders, her lips caught mid-smile, her eyes bright and full of secrets. For years, I'd walked past it without more than a glance. But now, I stood before it as if seeing it for the first time. Lily's eyes. The same shade. The same glint of warmth that hinted at mischief and curiosity. Even the tilt of her head, slightly off-center, playful, was identical to Emily's favorite pose. My throat tightened. "Emily," I whispered. The painted eyes stared back, patient and knowing. Behind me, the floor creaked softly. I turned, expecting Daniel, but it was only the draft sneaking through the cracked window frame. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by someone malicious, but by someone waiting to be remembered. I spent most of that morning trying to distract myself with chores, reading, anything to keep my mind from circling back to that portrait. But every time I passed through the hall, my gaze returned to it, drawn like a compass needle to north. And then, around noon, Lily's laughter echoed down the stairs. Daniel had brought her again. The sound should have irritated me. I hadn't agreed to this arrangement, but instead it did something strange. It steadied me. The house, usually heavy with grief, felt alive again, almost warm. I found her in the parlor, sitting cross-legged on the rug, coloring. Daniel stood nearby, fixing one of the light fixtures, pretending not to watch her every move like a man terrified of losing sight of the only thing that mattered. "Good morning, Lily," I said softly. She beamed up at me. "Hi, Aunt Emily." The words landed like a shock, even though I'd heard them before. Daniel froze, his jaw tightening, but I lifted a hand to stop him before he could scold her. "It's all right," I said, though my heart was pounding. "You can call me whatever you like." Lily smiled, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. I turned to Daniel. "She remembers that name." He didn't look at me. "Children pick up words," he said quietly. "They repeat what they hear. Or what they know," I murmured. He finally looked up, meeting my gaze. There was something behind his calmness now, a weight, a grief he was trying to carry without letting it spill. "Some things," he said, "are better left in the past." "And yet," I said softly, "the past seems to have found its way into my living room." His lips parted, as if to speak, but then he stopped himself. He turned back to his work, pretending to adjust the light fixture that didn't need fixing. I watched him for a long moment, then looked back at Lily. She was sketching again. The same three figures from yesterday. A woman, a man, and a little girl between them. Only this time there was something new. A house. The mansion. I leaned closer. "That's beautiful, Lily. Is this your home?" She shook her head. "No, it's Mommy's house." I froze. "Your Mommy's?" She nodded seriously. "Daddy says she used to live here." The room tilted. "What did you say?" "Mommy lived here before." Lily said matter-of-factly. He said she painted the big picture of the lady on the wall, the one that smiles. My breath hitched. I looked at Daniel. His back was turned, his shoulders rigid, as if he were bracing for the storm. She shouldn't have said that, I whispered. He didn't respond. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. Daniel worked without speaking. Lily napped in one of the guest rooms. I wandered the halls in a fog, my mind replaying every conversation, every glance, every lie I hadn't seen before. Mommy used to live here. I knew then that I couldn't ignore the attic any longer. By twilight, I found myself standing before its locked door again, the key trembling in my palm. Dust shimmered in the fading light. My hand hovered over the handle, but before I could turn it, I heard soft footsteps behind me. Mrs. Alden? Daniel's voice. I turned. He stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. The dying light from the window painted his face in half-shadow. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. Neither should you, I replied. He hesitated. It's not safe. For whom? He didn't answer. I looked back at the door. She used to paint up here, I said softly. Didn't she? His silence was confirmation enough. When I faced him again, my voice was trembling. Tell me the truth, Daniel. Who are you? His eyes softened, but his lips stayed shut. Please, he said instead. Don't open that door tonight. I stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Hours later, long after they'd gone, I sat alone in the drawing room. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers that glowed like eyes in the dark. I couldn't stop staring at the portrait on the wall. Emily's eyes followed me wherever I moved. Patient, knowing, accusing. You left me, I whispered to her painted face, and now you're haunting me through them. My voice cracked. What did I do to you, Em? Memories flooded in, sharp and unrelenting. The last fight. Her tear-streaked face. The way she said, you don't get to control who I love. I'd been cruel. I told her he wasn't good enough, that she'd ruin her life if she stayed with him. She'd run out of the house that night, and never come back. And now I wondered if Daniel had been that man. The thought made my stomach twist. I rose from the chair, restless. My mind was spinning, desperate for proof, for anything that could explain what was happening. My gaze fell on Daniel's cleaning cart, tucked neatly beside the stairs. Something glinted in the half-light, a corner of a photograph. It was wedged beneath a rag, torn and smudged with dust. I pulled it free carefully, my fingers trembling. Half the image was missing, but what remained was enough to steal my breath. My sister, Emily, standing in front of the very same mansion door I'd passed 1,000 times. Her hair was shorter, her face softer, her smile small but real. She wore a loose dress, and her hand rested gently over a rounded belly. Pregnant. My throat tightened as tears blurred my vision. I traced the edges of the torn photo, unable to stop shaking. Whoever had ripped it had done so deliberately, the other half gone. The man beside her, perhaps, erased on purpose. And I knew, deep down, that man was Daniel Hale, the man cleaning my house, the man who'd brought his daughter, my niece, home. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the photograph. Daniel's voice echoed faintly from somewhere down the hall, calling for Lily, his tone calm and low. But all I could hear was the sound of my sister's laughter from years ago, the one I'd silenced with my pride. The photo trembled in my hand as a single thought struck me, cold and final. Emily never ran away. She was hiding. You deserve to know, Daniel said, voice trembling. Your sister didn't disappear. She ran. When I confronted him, I wasn't sure if I wanted answers or revenge. The photograph still burned in my hand as I walked down the hall, each step heavy, deliberate, echoing against the marble like the footsteps of someone walking toward the end of something. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the wind pressing against the windows, and somewhere far off, Lily's laughter floated faintly, a ghostly sound that made my heart ache in ways I didn't understand. I found Daniel in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, his hands submerged in soapy water. It was a strange image. The man who'd somehow torn my past open, standing there doing dishes as if the world hadn't just tilted. When he saw me, he froze. The sound of running water filled the space between us. "You lied to me," I said. My voice came out calm, but it was the kind of calm that only exists right before it breaks. He dried his hands slowly, setting the plate aside with precision. "I didn't lie," he said softly. "I just didn't tell you everything." I slammed the photograph onto the counter. The paper stuck to the damp surface, half soaked. "You didn't tell me this." His gaze fell to the image. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Pain, nostalgia, guilt. He picked up the photo carefully, as if it were fragile, sacred. "Where did you find this?" "In your cart," I snapped. "You left it there." He closed his eyes, inhaling shakily. "I was going to tell you." "When?" I demanded. "After how many lies? After how many times you let me stand here thinking my sister was dead?" His voice dropped. "She is." That silenced me, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Not defensive, not cruel, just hollow. I took a step closer. "Then tell me the truth, Daniel. Who are you? What did you do to her?" He looked up, meeting my eyes, and I saw tears glinting there. Quiet, restrained, but real. "You deserve to know," he said finally, his voice breaking just slightly. "Your sister didn't disappear. She ran." The words hit me like cold water. "Ran," he nodded. "She left because of you, because of your father, because of what this house did to her." I shook my head, unable to process it. "That's not possible. She loved this place. She loved you," he interrupted gently. "But she couldn't stay." Silence fell, the kind that stretches so thin it hurts to breathe. He took a deep breath, setting the photo back down on the counter. "Emily and I met years ago. I was just a gardener back then. Your father hired me for a summer job. She used to paint near the gardens. Remember?" I did. Vividly. Emily, sitting beneath the oak trees with her easel, her laughter drifting through the wind, the smell of turpentine and lilac filling the air. "She used to bring me lemonade," Daniel said quietly. "At first we hardly spoke, but then she started asking about the plants, the roses, the ones by the fountain. She said they reminded her of you, of home." He smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. "By the end of that summer we were inseparable. We thought we were careful. But people noticed things. Stolen glances, quiet meetings. Your father found out?" I swallowed hard. "He fired you." "Yes," Daniel said, "and he told her if she ever saw me again he'd cut her off. No money, no home, nothing." My throat burned. I remembered those months, Emily's quietness, her distance, the way she'd lock herself in the attic, painting until dawn. "She came to me that night," Daniel continued. "She said she couldn't stay here anymore. Not with him watching. Not with you looking at her like she'd done something wrong." I flinched. "I was trying to protect her." "No," he said softly. "You were trying to protect what you thought mattered more. The family name." The truth stung, because he was right. "She was pregnant," I whispered. He nodded. "She wanted to tell you, but she was afraid. So she left. We moved 2 towns over. She painted, I worked. We built a life. For a while it was beautiful." His voice faltered, and he looked down at his hands. "But it didn't last. She got sick after Lily was born. Pneumonia. The doctor said she'd recover, but she didn't." A silence so heavy filled the air it felt physical. "She made me promise," he said, barely audible now. "Before she died, she made me promise that one day, when Lily was old enough, I'd bring her here, so she'd know where she came from, so she'd know you." I pressed a trembling hand to my mouth. "That's why I took this job," Daniel continued. "I wasn't here for charity. I wasn't looking for forgiveness. I was here because Emily wanted me to be." Tears blurred my vision. "You should have told me." "I didn't know how," he said quietly. I thought seeing Lily might help you remember her in a kinder way, not the way she left, but the way she loved. I turned away, gripping the counter for balance. The kitchen seemed to tilt around me. All the years I'd spent resenting my sister, thinking she'd abandoned us, all the while she'd been forced to choose between love and survival. She wanted you to have peace, Daniel said behind me. She wanted you to stop hating her. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. And Lily? She's everything Emily hoped she'd be, he said. Smart, brave, kind. She even hums when she draws, just like her mother. My knees nearly gave out. I braced myself against the table. God, I breathed. All this time. Daniel stepped closer, hesitating as if afraid to touch me. She wanted me to find you, he said softly. She left something for you here. I turned slowly. What do you mean? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. The edges were soft, worn, like it had been opened 1,000 times. He held it out to me with trembling fingers. What is that? I asked. Her last letter, he said. She wrote it before she died. She told me to give it to you when you were ready to forgive her. I stared at the letter, my heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. Ready to forgive her? I echoed. Daniel's gaze was steady, but his voice cracked as he spoke. She knew you'd never believe me until you saw her words for yourself. The letter trembled in his hand, the corner fluttering like it was alive. Please, he whispered, read it. He stepped back, his face pale but resolute. Emily wanted me to find you, Daniel said, his voice low and steady. She left something for you here. The letter between us seemed to hum with the weight of everything unsaid, and for the first time in years, I realized the truth wasn't buried in the past. It had been waiting for me inside my own home all along. My hands shook as I unlocked the attic, a room sealed by guilt, memory, and now, revelation. The key felt heavier than it should have. Daniel had left it for me that morning, wrapped in a piece of cloth like something sacred. He hadn't said a word when he handed it over. He didn't have to. His eyes told me everything. The truth was waiting upstairs. For years, I'd avoided that door like it carried a curse. Every time I passed the narrow staircase to the attic, I'd feel Emily's presence hovering in the air. The faint smell of paint thinner, the hum of her soft voice drifting through memory. I'd told myself I locked that room because I couldn't bear to face her things. But the truth was simpler. I locked it because I was afraid of what I might find. Now, as I stood before that old door with the key trembling in my hand, I realized that fear had never really left me. It had just changed shape. The lock gave easily, a soft click echoing louder than it should have. The hinges moaned as I pushed the door open. The air hit me first, cold, dry, still carrying the faint trace of oil paint and dust, a smell that belonged to another lifetime. I stepped inside, and the light from the hallway spilled across the floor, illuminating shapes long hidden beneath sheets. Canvases leaned against the walls, half covered in cobwebs. An easel stood in the corner, just where she'd left it. The room felt preserved, like time had stopped the night Emily disappeared. Each step I took stirred the dust into golden clouds, dancing in the beam of sunlight cutting through the small round window. My heart pounded as I reached for the nearest canvas and pulled the sheet away. It was a portrait, not of me, not of her, but of the both of us. Two sisters, side by side. My arm around her shoulder, her smile tilted toward mine. But something about it made me ache. I looked happy, yes, but she looked sad. Her eyes carried a knowing sorrow, as if she'd already decided to leave. I moved to the next canvas. This one was unfinished. Broad strokes, soft colors, the outline of a child, maybe 3 or 4 years old. The brush strokes around the face were gentle, loving, deliberate. The only completed part was the eyes, dark, bright, familiar. Lily's eyes. I stumbled back, my breath catching. For a moment the room spun. My hand found the back of a chair for balance as tears filled my vision. Emily had painted her child before she was even born. She had known somehow that this love would exist, that it would survive even if she didn't. I looked around the room again. The walls were covered in smaller sketches, studies of faces, bits of scenery, fragments of a life that had vanished. There was one of Daniel, too. I recognized him instantly, though he looked younger, his features softer, his expression full of the kind of love people only wear when they believe it will last forever. It was then I saw it. The easel. The last one. A single sheet of parchment was taped to its surface, yellowed around the edges but sealed with a familiar wax mark. The old Alden family crest. My breath hitched as I stepped closer. My name was written across the front. To my sister. I didn't move for a long time. I just stared at it, at the loops of her handwriting that looked so alive it almost hurt to see. My fingers shook as I reached out, afraid that if I touched it, it would crumble to dust, like the fragile proof that she'd ever existed. When I finally lifted the seal, the wax cracked softly, the sound sharp in the silence. Inside was a letter, folded carefully, the ink faded but still legible. The first line blurred through my tears. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. But she isn't. The paper trembled in my hand. My knees gave out before I realized I was sinking into the nearest chair. The words swam in front of me. I wiped my eyes and tried again, forcing myself to breathe. Don't hate me for leaving. I couldn't stay. Not when I knew what loving him would cost you. You always did everything right. And I always did everything wrong. But I need you to know, I didn't run away from you. I ran to save what little piece of myself I had left. I pressed the letter to my chest, choking on a sob. The paper felt warm against my skin, as if her words still carried her heartbeat. I kept reading. His name is Daniel Hale. He's kind, even when the world isn't. He works with his hands, but he holds hearts gently. You would have liked him if you'd given him a chance. You always said love should be logical, but he taught me it can be quiet, steady, and still mean everything. The tears came faster now. By the time you find this, I'll have our daughter. I hope she has your stubbornness. I hope she never knows what it means to live in fear of love. And if something happens to me, if I can't be there, promise me you'll find her. Promise me you'll love her the way I couldn't show you how to love me. My hands covered my mouth as I sobbed. I could almost hear her voice in the words, soft and full of that same gentle rebellion that had always set her apart. Every line felt like a confession, an apology, and a goodbye all at once. I left one more thing for you, something to remind you that not every ending is a tragedy. Look behind the last canvas by the window. You'll know when you see it. I looked up, tears still streaming down my face. The last canvas. The one by the round window, half shrouded in shadow. I stood and crossed the room, my legs weak, my breath uneven. When I pulled the sheet away, I found another painting hidden behind it. This one was different. Simple, unfinished. It was of the mansion itself, sunlight spilling over its roof. But at the very bottom, in faint, almost invisible strokes, she'd written 3 words. We come home. The brushwork stopped mid-letter, as if she'd been interrupted, or as if she'd decided that was enough. I pressed my fingers to the words, the paint still textured under my skin after all these years. The attic felt warmer now, lighter. It was as though she'd been waiting for me to find her, not in anger, but in forgiveness. Behind me, the wind shifted. The door creaked softly, the faintest sound of footsteps in the hall below. Daniel, maybe. Or just the house exhaling at last. I looked around one final time, taking in every canvas, every memory, every piece of her that still lived here. And then I folded the letter carefully, holding it close. As I turned to leave, a single beam of sunlight cut through the window, landing directly on the letter in my hands. The ink shimmered faintly, and the first line echoed in my mind like a whisper carried by the air. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. But she isn't. And in that moment, I realized she hadn't just meant herself. She meant the part of her still alive in the little girl who called me Aunt Emily. The words blurred through my tears. A confession, a plea, and a goodbye all at once. I must have read that first line a dozen times before I could breathe again. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. But she isn't. It felt like a heartbeat coming back to life, faint, fragile, and full of pain. My hands shook as I unfolded the rest of the letter. The paper crackled softly, each crease a scar of time. Emily's handwriting hadn't changed, elegant, careful, full of tiny flourishes that turned her words into something alive. Even now, even after all these years, it felt like she was sitting across from me, whispering her secrets into my trembling hands. You always said I was the dreamer, the one who never knew when to stop chasing the impossible. Maybe you were right. But what you never understood, what you couldn't see, was that I didn't run away to hurt you. I left because I couldn't breathe in that house anymore, not with Father watching, not with you trying to make me someone I wasn't. I blinked through tears, the edges of her words bleeding as they mixed with my own guilt. She was right. I had tried to control her, to protect her from the world. But really, I had been trying to protect the family's image, the Alden name, the legacy. She continued, "Do you remember the day you found me painting by the garden? You asked me what I saw in him. I couldn't explain it then, but I'll try now. He wasn't like the men we grew up around. He didn't care about titles or money. He looked at me and saw a person, not a possession. He listened when I spoke. He made me laugh. For the first time in my life, I felt free. I could almost hear her laughter in the words, that soft, mischievous sound that used to fill the house with sunlight. When Father found out about us, I begged him to understand. I told him I loved Daniel, truly loved him. But he said love doesn't feed a family name. He said I'd ruin everything. He told me you agreed with him. I stopped reading. My heart clenched. I could see the memory as if it were happening again. My father's hand slamming on the table, his voice echoing through the hall, Emily's tearful face, her trembling lip. He had looked at me and said, "Tell her she's wrong, Margaret. Tell her you agree." And I had, because I'd been afraid, because I'd thought loyalty meant obedience. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. That night, I packed my things. I wanted to say goodbye, but I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in your eyes. I thought if I left, you'd eventually forgive me. I told myself I was doing the right thing, but the truth is, I was running from your judgment, and from the life I knew would destroy me. Her words blurred again as I choked on a sob. I pressed my hand against my mouth, the weight of years collapsing inside me. Daniel and I started over. It wasn't easy. We lived in a small cottage near the river. He worked long hours, and I painted portraits for neighbors to earn extra money. We were happy, though. I used to hum when I painted, the way I did as a child. He'd tease me for it, said it was how he always knew I was at peace. A faint smile touched my lips through the tears. I could see it all. The two of them in a sunlit cottage, her paint-stained hands, his tired smile at the end of the day. She had found happiness, real happiness. Then her words darkened. But peace never lasts, does it? When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. Not because of the child, but because I knew she'd be caught between two worlds that would never accept her. The Aldens would never take her in, and Daniel's world would never understand mine. I wanted to tell you. I wanted to believe that maybe time had softened you, that you'd open the door if I knocked. But I couldn't risk hearing it slam shut again. The guilt burned through me. I'd spent years thinking she had abandoned me, when in truth, it had been the other way around. I had abandoned her first. With silence, with judgment, with pride. The letter went on, the handwriting shakier now. When Lily was born, I saw everything good I'd ever known in her eyes. She has your smile when she's stubborn, your calm when she's frightened. She even hums when she draws. Daniel says she got that from me. Maybe she got both of us. A tear landed on the page, smudging her words. But I've been sick, Maggie. I've tried to hide it from him. But he knows. The doctors call it pneumonia, but I think it's just exhaustion. From fighting the world, from running, from pretending I'm stronger than I am. If something happens to me, I need you to do what I never could. Protect her. Love her. Tell her who I was. Not the woman who ran, but the sister who loved you enough to let go. I pressed my hand over my heart, trembling. She'd used the nickname only she called me, Maggie. The last time I'd heard it spoken aloud, it was through tears and anger. Now it sounded like forgiveness. Her next words broke me completely. Please don't hate Daniel. He never stopped believing in you, even when I did. He said one day you'd find your way back to us. He said forgiveness doesn't come when you're ready. It comes when you can't carry the weight anymore. And I think he was right. I wiped my cheeks, though the tears wouldn't stop. The last paragraph was short, but it carried the weight of everything she'd ever wanted to say. If you're reading this, it means Daniel kept his promise. It means Lily has found her way home. Be kind to her, Maggie. She's all that's left of me. And don't worry. He'll bring her to you when the time is right. The final line wavered, as though written with trembling hands. A drop of ink had bled through the paper like a heartbeat. I sat there in the attic for what felt like hours, the letter trembling in my grasp, the air around me thick with ghosts. Every stroke of her pen was a confession, a plea and a goodbye all at once. Finally, I folded it carefully, pressing the crease as though sealing her voice back into the page. I held it to my chest and whispered, I forgive you. And maybe, somewhere, beyond time, beyond grief, she forgave me too. As I traced the last line again, he'll bring her to you when the time is right, I realized that the promise wasn't just for Emily, it was for Daniel. And somewhere in this house I could hear him moving, quiet and steady, as if the time she'd written about had finally come. I looked at Daniel, the man I'd once despised, and realized he'd kept his promise for years. When I came down from the attic, the house felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but quieter, calmer, as if the walls had finally exhaled after holding their breath for too long. The weight of the letter still pressed against my palm. Emily's voice lingered in my head, soft and steady, guiding every step I took. I found Daniel in the study. He was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his reflection caught in the glass like a ghost looking back at itself. The afternoon light pooled around him, casting the room in a muted glow. For the first time, I saw the exhaustion in his face, the kind that doesn't come from labor, but from carrying something far heavier than work. He turned when he heard me. His expression was cautious, as if he couldn't tell which version of me he was about to face, the woman who hated him or the one Emily had written about. You read it, he said quietly. I nodded. My throat felt raw, my voice small. Every word, he lowered his gaze. Then you know everything. Yes, I whispered. I know. For a long time we didn't speak. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of all the years, the misunderstandings, the grief. I hated you, I said finally. Not because I knew you, but because I didn't. Because I needed someone to blame for her leaving. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes were steady. I understand. No, I said, shaking my head. You don't. I thought she ran away because she didn't care about us. I told myself she was selfish. It made it easier to hate her than to admit that I was the one who pushed her away. I took a breath, my chest trembling. She loved you, Daniel. She wrote about you like you were the only good thing she ever did right. His eyes flickered, and he looked away toward the garden. She saved me, he said softly, in every way that mattered. I studied him for a moment, the lines etched into his face, the quiet way he carried himself. For years, I'd looked at him and seen a stranger who didn't belong here. But now, all I could see was a man who'd spent his life honoring a promise. You could have come here years ago, I said. You could have told me the truth. He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. She made me promise to wait until the time was right, until Lily was old enough to understand, until you were ready to... Listen. I held up the letter, the paper trembling in my hand. She said the same thing, that you'd bring her to me when the time was right. He nodded once. Emily always believed in timing, even when I didn't. I felt tears burn my eyes again. You kept your promise. Daniel swallowed hard. Every single one. I sat down on the edge of the desk, the letter resting on my lap. For a moment, we both just stood there in that heavy, sacred quiet. I owe you an apology, I said finally. He shook his head. No, you don't owe me anything. Yes, I do, I insisted, for hating you, for not seeing her happiness for what it was, for letting my pride ruin what little time we could have had together. He didn't answer, but his silence wasn't cold. It was forgiving. After a moment, I asked, how much did she suffer? His voice softened. She didn't. Not at the end. She talked about you, even when she was too weak to stand. She said she could still hear your voice in her dreams, that she hoped one day you'd forgive her. My breath caught. I forgave her the moment I read that letter. He nodded slowly, his own eyes wet. Then she got what she wanted. For a long time, we both just stood there, two broken halves of the same story finally finding their way back to the beginning. Then Daniel reached into his coat pocket. There's something else, he said quietly. Something she wanted you to have. He pulled out a small velvet pouch, faded and worn from years of being carried. He set it gently on the desk between us. I hesitated before opening it, afraid of what new memory might come spilling out. Inside was a delicate gold locket, its surface scratched and dull with age. I recognized it instantly. She used to wear this, I whispered. Every day. Daniel nodded. She never took it off. Not until she gave it to me before she passed. I held the locket carefully, my fingers tracing the small engraving on the back. For M. She told me, Daniel said, that one day you'd be ready to open it. I looked up sharply. What's inside? He smiled sadly. She didn't tell me. Only that when you were ready, you'd understand. The metal was cool against my palm. I wanted to open it right there, but part of me was afraid of what new wave of grief might come. So I closed my hand around it and nodded. Thank you, I said softly, for keeping her alive, for bringing her back to me. He met my gaze. She never really left, Mrs. Alden. She's in that little girl's laughter. In your voice when you say her name. She's been here the whole time. You just stopped looking. Tears welled in my eyes again, but they didn't hurt this time. They felt like release. I managed a small smile. You're right. She's here. Daniel exhaled deeply, like he'd been holding that breath for years. Then my promise is complete. I shook. My head. No, it isn't. Not yet. He frowned slightly. You said she left something for me, I reminded him. You said she wanted me to open this when I was ready. I'm ready. He stepped closer, placing the locket back into my hand, his touch gentle. Then this is it, he said. This is the last piece of her story. The gold shimmered faintly in the light. It wasn't the jewelry that mattered. It was what it represented. A connection. A bridge between the woman I'd lost and the one she'd left behind. I looked up at him. You've kept every promise she asked of you. How do I thank you for that? He smiled, the first real smile I'd ever seen from him. By keeping yours. My promise? To love her the way she asked you to? I nodded slowly, clutching the locket to my chest. I will. He turned toward the door, his shoulders slumping slightly as though a great weight had finally lifted. She'd be happy, he said quietly. She always said you'd find your way back to each other. He paused in the doorway, the fading sunlight outlining his figure. There's one more thing, he said, glancing back. I looked up. He smiled softly, the sadness in his eyes turning almost peaceful. She wanted you to open this when you're ready. He nodded toward the locket in my hand. When you do, you'll know what she meant by home. Daniel's footsteps faded down the hall, leaving me alone in the quiet study. I looked down at the locket gleaming in my palm, my reflection bending across its curved surface. Slowly, I turned it over, running my thumb across the engraving for M, and whispered, "I'm ready, Emily." The clasp clicked softly, the sound echoing through the empty room like the closing of a circle. Inside the locket was a photo of the three of us: the sister I lost, the man I misjudged, and the child who unknowingly brought us together. For a long moment, I just stared at the small golden locket in my palm. It looked so ordinary, scratched, aged, the kind of trinket people wear and forget. But something about it pulsed with a quiet life, as if it had been waiting all these years for this very moment. Daniel's words echoed softly in my mind. "She wanted you to open this when you're ready." The room was still. The faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel was the only sound left, steady as a heartbeat. My fingers trembled as I pressed the tiny clasp. It resisted for a second, stubborn, almost symbolic, before yielding with a faint click. Inside, time stood still. On one side was a small, worn photograph, edges frayed, colors faded by years of keeping. But the image was clear enough to recognize Emily, Daniel, and a baby. My breath caught in my throat. Emily was sitting by the riverbank, sunlight in her hair, Daniel's arm around her shoulders, and in her lap, a baby with eyes wide and bright. Lily. For a heartbeat, I forgot to breathe. The world blurred around the edges as I traced the photograph with my fingertips. Emily's smile was soft but certain, the kind of smile that carried peace. She looked happy. Happier than I'd ever seen her, even as a child. It wasn't the forced smile she used to wear for family portraits. This one was real, alive. Daniel looked younger, unburdened, the hint of pride on his face unmistakable. And Lily, even as an infant, had Emily's same curious eyes, her same spark. I pressed the locket to my heart, closing my eyes as the tears came. For years, I'd told myself that Emily had betrayed us, that she'd chosen a man over her family, over me. But as I held that photo, I realized how wrong I'd been. She hadn't abandoned me. She'd been protecting the only happiness she'd ever known. Her words from the letter echoed in my mind. "Be kind to her, Maggie. She's all that's left of me." I opened my eyes and looked toward the doorway. Lily's laughter drifted faintly from down the hall. Soft, bright, full of the same warmth that used to fill this house when Emily was alive. For the first time, I didn't hear loss in that sound. I heard her return. I walked through the mansion slowly, each step echoing through corridors that had once felt hollow. The afternoon light spilled through the tall windows, painting everything gold. I found Lily sitting cross-legged on the floor in the drawing room, surrounded by crayons and paper. She looked up when she saw me. "Miss Margaret," she chirped, smiling wide. "I drew something." I smiled, kneeling beside her. "May I see?" She nodded eagerly, turning the paper toward me. My breath caught. It was a picture of three people, a woman with long brown hair, a man holding her hand, and a little girl between them. "Who are they?" I asked gently, though I already knew. She pointed to the figures, one by one. "That's my daddy. That's my mommy. And that's you." My vision blurred. I reached out, tracing the childish outlines with my trembling fingers. The drawing wasn't perfect. The colors bled outside the lines. The proportions were off. But it carried a kind of purity I hadn't felt in years. I looked at her. "Why did you draw me, sweetheart?" Lily tilted her head, as if the answer were obvious. "Because Mommy said family always finds each other again." My breath hitched. My throat closed around the words I couldn't form. I wanted to tell her everything. About Emily, about the love she came from, about how her mother had painted her before she was even born. But instead, I just pulled her close. She laughed softly as I hugged her, her tiny arms wrapping around my neck. Her hair smelled faintly of paint and sunlight, just like Emily's used to when we were girls. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Daniel appeared quietly in the doorway, his expression soft, uncertain. He watched as Lily held up the locket to show him. "Look, Daddy," she said proudly. "Aunt Margaret opened it." He froze for a moment, then smiled. "She did, huh?" I met his gaze. "She was right," I said quietly. "Emily was right about all of it." He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "She usually was." I stood, holding the locket between my fingers. She wanted this to bring us together. Not to remind us of what we lost, but what she left behind. Daniel's eyes glistened, though he blinked the tears away. "She'd be happy," he said softly, "seeing you two like this." I smiled faintly, my voice trembling. "She is." For a while, none of us spoke. The sunlight shifted across the floor, the air warm and golden. Lily giggled as she drew another picture, this time humming under her breath, the same soft tune Emily used to hum when she painted. I turned toward the window, the locket still warm in my palm. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Daniel paused, listening. Then he nodded. "I do." The melody floated through the air. Faint, sweet, familiar. It wasn't just Lily's humming. It was memory itself, finding its way home. I closed my hand around the locket, pressing it to my chest. "She's here," I said quietly. "In her laughter, in her daughter's eyes. She never left." Daniel's voice broke slightly. "That's what she wanted." We stood together, two souls stitched by the same loss, finally at peace with what love had asked of us. Lily's laughter rang out again, high and bright, echoing down the long marble hallway. And for the first time since Emily's death, it didn't sound like an echo at all. As Lily darted through the hall, her laughter rippled through the mansion. Bright, familiar, hauntingly sweet. I closed my eyes and listened, a tear sliding down my cheek. For a moment, I could almost see Emily at the top of the stairs, smiling down at us. And when Lily's voice called, "Come play, Aunt Margaret," it wasn't just the little girl's laughter that filled the air. It was Emily's, too. I used to believe the mansion was a tomb for memories. Now it's a home again. 6 months had passed since the day I opened Emily's locket. But sometimes it still felt like she was here, in the echo of laughter down the hallway, in the soft hum of Lily's voice as she played, in the faint scent of paint that drifted from the attic. The house that had once been my prison had changed. No, we had changed it. There was life here again. The heavy velvet curtains I used to keep drawn were now open wide, letting sunlight spill across the grand staircase. Dust no longer gathered on the frames of old portraits. Instead, fresh flowers brightened every corner. The rooms that had once been silent now carried sound. Footsteps, giggles, the creak of floorboards that no longer belonged to ghosts but to the living. Lily loved the house in a way I never could. She filled it with questions, with energy, with warmth. She had the same fearless curiosity Emily used to have, the same way of touching the world like it was something sacred and endless. Every morning she'd run through the halls barefoot, her laughter bouncing off the walls. "It's so big, Aunt Margaret," she'd exclaim, spinning until her curls fanned out like sunlight. The first time she called me Aunt Margaret, I almost cried. I'd forgotten what it was like to hear love spoken so simply. Daniel had changed too. He no longer looked like the weary man who used to move through the mansion's halls like a shadow. The lines on his face were still there, but softer now. He smiled more. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, I'd see him standing in the garden, staring up at Emily's old window, as if speaking to her through the wind. We'd fallen into a rhythm, not as strangers bound by tragedy, but as family slowly learning to live again. I didn't think of Daniel as the man who'd once cleaned my floors. He was the man my sister loved, the father of my niece, and the keeper of promises I never deserved. He'd fixed the old greenhouse in the garden, repairing each shattered pane of glass himself. It had been Emily's favorite place. Now it was Lily's. She called it Mommy's Garden and spent hours there, planting flowers in the soil while Daniel and I watched from the doorway. Sometimes I'd bring my tea and sit beside her, watching her tiny hands work with quiet purpose. "Mommy liked daisies best," she told me once, her voice soft. "She said they were brave little flowers. They always find a way to grow, even when no one's watching." I'd smiled through tears. She was right, sweetheart. She was always right. At night, when the house went quiet and Lily had gone to bed, Daniel and I would talk by the fire. At first it was awkward, two people from different worlds, bound by the ghost of the same woman. But over time, the conversations grew easier. We talked about Emily, about Lily, about the past that had once divided us and the future we were building together. One night, he said something I never forgot. "She used to worry about you," he murmured, his gaze lost in the flames. "Said you carried too much silence, that you kept love locked away like a secret." I looked at him for a long time, the truth of it stinging and healing all at once. "She wasn't wrong," I said quietly. He smiled faintly. "She never was." That night, as the firelight flickered across the walls, I realized that Emily hadn't just given me Lily. She'd given me back a piece of myself, the part that believed in connection, the part that remembered what it felt like to love without fear. One morning, Lily came running into my study, her hands covered in paint. "Aunt Margaret," she called, "come see what I did." I followed her up the stairs, my curiosity piqued. The attic door, once locked, once forbidden, now stood, open. The scent of oil paint and turpentine filled the air, mingling with the soft light pouring through the skylight. In the center of the room stood an easel. On it, an unfinished painting, one of Emily's last works. I recognized it instantly. She'd started it years ago, a portrait of two women standing by the garden gate. I'd always assumed one of them was her, and the other was our mother. But now, looking closer, I realized the second figure was me. The canvas had remained untouched for years, until now. Lily stood beside it, a small brush in her hand, her cheeks streaked with color. She'd filled in the lower corner, soft strokes of pink and gold, sunlight spilling across the painted garden. The colors didn't match perfectly, but the emotion did. It was full of life, full of love. "I wanted to finish it for Mommy," she said proudly, "so she can see it when she looks down." I felt something break open inside me, something gentle, something necessary. I knelt beside her, my voice trembling. "Can I help?" Her eyes lit up. "You paint too?" I smiled. "I used to, a long time ago." We worked side by side, filling the empty spaces Emily had left behind. Each brushstroke felt like a heartbeat, each color like a word she never got to say. The attic, once filled with ghosts, now pulsed with warmth and laughter. When we finished for the day, I stepped back and looked at the painting. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was whole. Lily wiped her hands on her apron, tilting her head to study it. "Do you think Mommy will like it?" she asked. I swallowed the lump in my throat and smiled. I think she already does. Downstairs, Daniel called for dinner. Lily ran ahead, her laughter trailing behind her like sunlight through dust. I lingered in the attic for a moment longer, staring at the painting. The two women in the portrait, Emily and me, stood side by side, hands almost touching. And in the newly painted sunlight between them, Lily's brush had added a third shadow. Small, bright, belonging. I smiled, my chest tightening with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. The mansion wasn't a monument to grief anymore. It was a living memory, rebuilt by the hands of a child who carried the best parts of us both. I whispered into the quiet air, "You did it, Emily. You brought us home." The soft rustle of paintbrushes filled the room again as Lily dipped her brush in yellow, humming that same old tune her mother once loved. I sat beside her, adding the final touch, a streak of light across the sky. As the sun set through the attic window, its glow fell across the painting, across the faces of two sisters and a little girl between them. And for the first time, I didn't see loss. I saw family, I saw us. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Tell me in the comments. Do you believe some families are destined to find their way back? Your thoughts matter. Here, subscribe for more stories that remind us love never truly fades. It just finds a new home